And now from Treasure Island Oldies.com. Here is this week's rock and roll news for the week of May 26th. This week in 1958, Jerry Lee Lewis was booed off the stage in England 2 days after announcing his marriage to his cousin Myra, and his British tour abruptly ended the very next night. Elvis news this week in 1953, he hitchhiked to Meridian, Mississippi to perform in the first Jimmie Rogers Memorial Talent Show, where he took second place. His movie Tickle Me opened nationally this week in 1965, and he completed his basic training this week in the U.S. Army at Fort Hood, Texas. And his two-sided single, Let Me Be Your Teddy Bear and Loving You, was released this week in 1957. Carl Perkins finally performed on the Perry Como TV show 2 months after he was hospitalized from a car crash while traveling on his way to perform on the show. Moon River was named Record and Song of the Year at the Grammy Awards this week in 1962. In 1950, Frank Sinatra made his television debut. It was on the Bob Hope show Star Spangled Review. Buddy Holly received his draft notice this week in 1958, but he was refused induction because of his 2800 eyesight, as well as having a stomach ulcer. In 1967, the association made their debut on the TV show The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Buddy Holly saw the John Wayne film The Searchers, and the line in that movie, "That'll Be the Day," inspired him to write a song with that title this week in 1956. 10 years later, in 1966, the Monkees started shooting their television show. Filming began on the movie To Sir With Love that featured Lulu this week in 1966. The Rolling Stones arrived in New York for their very first American tour. Doris Day started a 5-year recording contract with Columbia Records this week in 1956, and that deal at the time was worth $1 million. In 1967, the Beatles released their Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, released the very next day in the United States. Dion reunited with the Belmonts for an Oldies revival show this week in 1972. Bobby Darin played at the Copacabana in New York for the first time in 1960. The Rolling Stones had their first concert in the United States this week in 1964 at a high school in Lynn, Massachusetts. Production began on the movie Ferry Cross the Mersey that starred Jerry and the Pacemakers and Cilla Black this week in 1964. Big Brother and the Holding Company filmed a part in the movie Petulia this week in 1967. The Rolling Stones also made their TV debut in the United States on The Les Crane Show. He later recorded Desiderata. Chuck Berry opened Berry Park near St. Louis in 1961 this week. In 1965, Art Garfunkel graduated from Columbia University in New York. And in 2008, Smokey Robinson was inducted into the Apollo Theater Hall of Fame in Harlem. In the studio, Don McLean recorded American Pie in 1971. Elvis cut You're the Devil in Disguise in 1963. Little Anthony and the Imperials recorded Tears on My Pillow in 1958. Bing Crosby recorded the all-time classic and one of the biggest selling records of all time in 1942, White Christmas. Speaking of White, the Beatles began recording their White album this week in 1968. The Rolling Stones cut Honky Tonk Women in 1969. Badfinger began recording Day After Day in 1971. And Sam Cooke recorded You Send Me in 1957. Birthdays for you: Stevie Nicks from Fleetwood Mac is 65. Peggy Lee was born in 1920. Ramsey Lewis is 78 this week. Cilla Black 70. Gladys Knight 68. John Fogerty from Creedence Clearwater Revival is 67. Billy Vera is turning 68. Joey Levine from the Ohio Express, Third Rail, Reunion, and many other groups that were studio concoctions. He's having a birthday and turning 63. Sir Monty Rock III, also known as Disco Tex and his Sexolettes, is turning 71. Peter Yarrow from Peter, Paul and Mary, 75. Pat Boone is 79. Ron Wood from the Rolling Stones and the Faces is 65. Linda Scott turned 68. Nelson Riddle, born this week in 1921. Johnny Bond, Hot Rod Lincoln fame, born in 1915. Jimmy Jones is 75. Sammy Turner is 80. Charlie Watts from the Rolling Stones turned 71. Marvin Hamlish, born this week in 1944. Otis Williams from the Charms is 76, and Lenny Welch is turning 73. And from TreasureIslandOldies.com, That's your rock and roll news for this week, the week of May 26th. Come to the Treasure Island Oldies blog for all the late breaking news by going to treasureislandoldies.com and then click blog. Thank you for listening. I'm Michael Godin.
Treasure Island Oldies.